In this chapter, you'll be learning about analysis, which is the process of breaking an argument down into its component parts and evaluating each of them separately. You'll be looking to answer the questions: what is an argument? What 4 guidelines can help you identify what we call an extraordinary claim? What are 4 different types of evidence and the strengths and weaknesses of each one? And what is the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning? There are several terms that you should know following this chapter. On the right-hand side, cause and effect, chronological, all the way down through mixed pattern. Those are all patterns of organization that we're going to discuss. And on the left-hand side, testimonials, expert testimony, facts, analogies, and hypotheticals. Those are all types of evidence. To start with, we're going to discuss the idea of analysis in overview. So an analysis is when you take apart an argument and identify its component pieces. So you're going to identify what is the author's claim, what are they trying to convince you or persuade you of or about. Then you need to identify the evidence that the author is using to support that claim. So you would need to be able to determine whether the evidence is facts and testimonials or analogies or hypotheticals. And finally, you'll need to be able to identify the organizational pattern that the author has used, the way that they've organized their argument. So we'll talk about those pieces more in detail throughout this presentation. First of all, not every statement is an argument. An argument specifically is a claim with evidence or proof that leads to a conclusion. In other words, an argument is trying to convince you or persuade you of something, trying to get you to change your mind or change your behavior in some way. The first example on the screen, I don't like MCU's treatment of women, is not an argument. When I say that, I am not trying to change anyone's mind or change their behavior in any way. The second example, however, is much more clear. I am making a claim, I am presenting evidence, and I am ending with a conclusion that is designed to change the behavior of my audience. We have to watch out for extraordinary claims when we are trying to identify the claims that an author is making. Extraordinary claims can be supernatural, too good to be true, far-reaching, or overdramatic or designed to frighten you. So watch out for claims that fall into these categories, as they probably need a little extra examination in order to be believed. Typically, claims that fall into these categories are not as credible. So we have to be extra good critical thinkers in making sure that we aren't believing these claims without solid evidence. One of the things that we are going to cover in this chapter is the different types of evidence that an author might use to support his or her arguments. There are 4 main types of evidence that we'll be discussing: facts and statistics, testimonials, analogies, and hypotheticals. We'll also be learning about the strengths and weaknesses of each different type of evidence and what we should be looking out for in our analysis. Facts and statistics typically are considered to be strong, authoritative pieces of evidence because facts can be proven, right? And statistics typically are objective, they're unbiased. So when we see a percentage or a number or data, we feel like that is very trustworthy information and it's very strong evidence. But you have to be careful because facts can be inaccurate, or they can be simply made up by the source. Unless you are fact-checking to make sure that the numbers are accurate, you definitely have to question where these numbers came from. Statistics can also be manipulated or misrepresented. It is very, very easy to put some numbers into a chart and leave out other numbers that don't necessarily support your conclusion. And convince people that you have solid data to support or to back up your claim. So as an audience, we, critical thinkers, need to be very careful when we see facts and statistics. we cannot just automatically assume that they're accurate. We have to be able to determine their credibility. We want to look at the source and the author and where they come from and whether they're believable or not, and whether it looks like information has been left out. Testimonials are another strong piece of evidence. People use testimonials frequently, and we definitely believe in people's own experiences, right? Those lived experiences are very valuable. Anybody who's ever checked Amazon reviews before they purchased an item knows that in some ways we trust a person's testimonial even more than we trust the actual company selling the product or the facts that they're presenting. However, it is important to remember that testimonials are only opinions. They cannot be proven, and we have to be careful that the testimonial is coming from a trustworthy source. And it's hard to pit a testimonial against data. So if the testimonial, for example, if your aunt's neighbor, looking at the example in the box at the bottom of the screen, if your aunt's neighbor said not to take a particular medication because she had a terrible, terrible reaction, would you weigh that testimonial more heavily than you would weigh your doctor's advice and the data that he is probably relying on when he prescribes the medication? So you have to be careful with testimonials as well. Students typically have a hard time understanding how an analogy or a comparison can be a piece of evidence for an argument. But think about how sometimes making a comparison can help to make a complicated situation more clear or relatable. An analogy can also sometimes take the emotion out of an argument. So in the example at the bottom of the screen, in this example, the author is talking about how cars are an analogy for guns, and the way that we regulate cars and put safety measures in place should be similar to the ways that we regulate guns and put safety measures in place. So this is an example of a comparison or an analogy. It is important to note, however, that not all analogies are valid, and sometimes an analogy can be a distraction, or it can just be an invalid comparison, where you're not really comparing two of the same things, and that can cause problems in an argument. So you have to be able to determine whether an analogy is valid or not. Hypotheticals are imaginary situations that can sometimes help the audience think about the possibilities or the implications of a situation. It can also make a topic easily relatable or easier to understand. For example, if you were arguing with your spouse about who washes dishes more often, you each are going to have your own position. But if you said, okay, imagine that we were talking about mowing the lawn, and you did blah, 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 and I did blah, 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 sometimes that imaginary situation would be easier for your audience to understand than the actual situation that you're talking about. It sometimes helps people think about a situation in a different way. You do have to be careful, though, that hypotheticals are based on possibilities, and there's no guarantee that the imaginary situation you've created is exactly the way the real-life situation would work out. So be careful with hypotheticals. It's also important to identify the different pieces of evidence in an article and avoid counter-evidence, avoid assumptions, and avoid fallacies. We've talked about assumptions in a previous chapter, and we'll talk about fallacies in the next chapter. But counter-evidence is essentially just evidence that doesn't support your thesis. It's like saying, I agree that school uniforms should be mandated in schools, but I know that some people claim it stifles students' creativity. However, I blah, blah, blah. So you couldn't say that school uniforms stifling students' creativity is a piece of evidence for my argument there, because it actually doesn't support my thesis. It's just a statement of the opposition. It's also important to be able to determine inductive versus deductive logic. Most arguments typically will fall into one of these two categories. So we'll talk first about inductive logic, which is bottom-up processing, where you build a case from specific data and evidence. So you start out with the clues and the evidence, and you build up to a conclusion. For example, a crime scene investigator collects all the evidence, puts all the pieces together, does an investigation, and then at the end of the investigation, hopefully they are able to come to a conclusion about what happened. This is opposite to deductive logic, which is top-down processing, where you start with a conclusion. Okay, the detective already knows who committed the crime, but they can't convict until they have the evidence to prove it. So you start with the conclusion in mind, the end result, and you build a case kind of backwards by building support for it. So there are a couple of other examples here. And you should be able to determine how an author is organizing their argument by saying whether or not they've started with a lot of evidence and built up to a conclusion, or whether they've first presented the conclusion and then supported it with evidence. Finally, part of patterns of organization is also determining how the author has presented the evidence that they have to share. Are they using a chronological order? Are they comparing and contrasting two things? Are they setting up a cause and effect pattern? Many cases, an article will have multiple different patterns of organization scattered throughout. And your job when you are analyzing and doing an analysis is to be able to determine that in paragraph 3, the author is comparing Chinese parenting strategies to Western parenting strategies, and she does this by using XYZ example or quote, and then you need to be able to determine whether or not that's effective, and say something like, this is a very effective way to present the idea, so that you can see side by side, the different parenting strategies. So you'll need to be able to identify different patterns of organization throughout the articles that you're analyzing. And that, folks, is the end of the analysis chapter. I hope this has helped. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions.